Greetings, Culture Warriors. This is Jeff Vieira, author of Culture is Everything, with another dispatch from the front. Today, I want to talk to you about one of the odder stories that has come over the transom in the business world in recent months. And as always, we'll take a look at that through the lens of culture and values and see what we can add to the analysis around these events. This story comes to us from U.S. News & World Report. It's an Associated Press story originally, May 20th, 2020. Headline, 2 accused of smuggling ex-Nissan boss out of Japan in a box. U.S. authorities have arrested a former Green Beret and his son who are accused of helping former Nissan Motor Company chairman Carlos Ghosn flee Japan while he awaited trial on charges of financial misconduct. A former Green Beret and his son were arrested Wednesday in Massachusetts on charges they smuggled Nissan Motor Company chairman Carlos Ghosn out of Japan in a box while he awaited trial there on financial misconduct charges. Michael Taylor, a 59-year-old former Green Beret and private security specialist, and Peter Taylor, 27, are wanted by Japan on charges. They helped Ghosn escape the country in December after he was released on bail. The Taylors were arrested by the U.S. Marshal Service in Harvard. They appeared before a federal judge from jail via video conference, wearing orange jumpsuits and tan face coverings because of the coronavirus pandemic. Assistant U.S. Attorney Stephen Hassink said Japan plans, as quickly as possible, to submit a formal request to extradite the Taylors. An attorney for the Taylors said they plan to challenge Japan's extradition request on several legal and factual grounds. Michael Taylor is a distinguished veteran and patriot, both he and his son deserve a full and fair hearing regarding these issues, both before the courts and the executive branch, Paul V. Kelly said in an email. The tale of the daring escape began on December 28, 2019, when Peter Taylor arrived in Japan and met with Ghosn at the Grand Hyatt Tokyo for about an hour, authorities said. Just before 10 a.m. the next day, Michael Taylor flew into Osaka, Japan, on a chartered Bombardier Global Express jet from Dubai with another man, George Antoine Zayek, carrying 2 large black boxes with them. The elder Taylor was experienced with sticky situations. Over the years, he has been hired by parents to rescue abducted children, gone undercover for the FBI in a sting on a Massachusetts drug gang, and worked as a contractor for the U.S. military in Iraq and Afghanistan. The last assignment had landed him in a Utah jail for 14 months, caught in a federal contract fraud case that upended Taylor's family and finances before he agreed to plead guilty to 2 charges. It's not clear yet how Ghosn hooked up with Taylor. At their arrival, Taylor and Zayek, his Lebanese-born colleague, told airport employees they were musicians carrying audio equipment. Meanwhile, Ghosn, who was out of custody on a hefty bail, headed to the Grand Hyatt in Tokyo and met up with Peter Taylor in his hotel room, authorities said. The elder Taylor and Zayek joined after a brief stop to rent a separate room near the airport, and soon after their arrival, the group left the Grand Hyatt and split up. Peter Taylor headed to the airport to hop on a flight to China, court documents said. The others hopped on a bullet train and arrived at the Shin Osaka train station about 4 hours later, authorities said. They hailed a taxi and went back to the towering luxury hotel where Taylor and Zayek had booked a room earlier in the day. They all went in, only 2 would be seen walking out. Authorities say Ghosn was inside one of the big black boxes, lugged by the 2 men to Japan's Kansai International Airport, authorities said. The boxes passed through a security checkpoint without being checked and were loaded onto a private jet headed for Turkey, the document said. At 11:10, the chartered Bombardier, its windows fitted with pleated shades, lifted off with Ghosn stored aboard. The flight went first to Turkey, then to Lebanon, where Ghosn has citizenship but which has no extradition treaty with Japan. 2 days later, Ghosn announced publicly he was in Lebanon. He said he fled because he could not expect a fair trial, was subjected to unfair conditions in detention and was barred from meeting his wife under his bail conditions. Gosin maintains he is innocent of the allegations he underreported his future income and committed a breach of trust by diverting Nissan money for his personal gain. He says that the compensation was never decided on or received, and that the Nissan payments were for legitimate business purposes. A spokesman for Gosin's legal team declined to comment on Wednesday's developments. Peter Taylor had traveled to Japan at least 3 times since July 2019 and met with Gosin at least 7 times during those visits, according to court records. Japanese officials had also issued a provisional warrant for Zayek's arrest. Lebanese authorities said Gosin entered the country legally on a French passport, although he had been required to surrender all 3 of his passports to his lawyers under terms of his bail. He also has Brazilian and Lebanese citizenship. The security business that Michael Taylor and a partner set up decades ago was initially focused on private investigations, but their caseload grew through corporate work and unofficial referrals from the State Department and FBI, including parents whose children had been taken overseas by former spouses. In 2012, federal prosecutors alleged Taylor had won a U.S. military contract to train Afghan soldiers by using secret information passed along from an American officer. When Taylor learned the contract was being investigated, he asked an FBI agent and friend to intervene, prosecutors charged. The government seized $5 million from the bank account of Taylor's company. Facing 50 charges, he spent 14 months in jail before agreeing to plead guilty to 2 counts. The government agreed to return $2 million to the company, as well as confiscated vehicles. This is a story, a humdinger, for sure, where most of the useful information is between the lines. It's in what is not said. And so you really have to dig in and think about it a little bit in order to really understand what's going on here. So first off, I spent a couple years in Japan. I have some familiarity with Japanese business practices, and I well remember the storm of controversy that surrounded Gosin, not due to the alleged illegalities he engaged in, not due to his incredible escape, but because he was a tattoo head Nissan. The Japanese are not generally known for having their largest companies run by non-Japanese, non-Asians. It's in Japan, there's a culture and a pride that they take in having their largest and most successful companies be homegrown Japanese companies. Indeed, I saw firsthand in the 90s as Japan started to offshore more and more of its manufacturing production, the care that they took to ensure that those companies were run in a Japanese manner by Japanese leaders. And that filtered down into their supply chain. They wanted to make sure that anyone they did business with on the mainland of China would have similar values. So when they tapped Gosin to head Nissan, it sent shockwaves. This was a big change for the Japanese. They are not known for big sweeping changes like that. So Gosin was controversial long before any hint of impropriety arose. When they talk about how they got Gosin out of Japan, in other reports, they claimed that the box that they pulled him out in was a bass box. So if you think of a large stand-up musical bass of the kind that they used to have in jazz and before electrical guitar kind of bass came onto the stage in the late 50s and early 60s, those big bases that you spin around during performances, that's the box that those fit in is what they're talking about. So it's a very large box. It really stands out. So the notion that these guys were able to get those boxes into Japan in the first place without having them be inspected, put people in those boxes and take them out. I was also stationed in Turkey for a brief time, and I can assure you, every foreigner who gets on a Turkish airplane or gets off, an airplane to get on another one, they inspect your luggage. Turkey is very sensitive to the threat of airborne terrorism. And so they do an extremely thorough manual search. In fact, my experience was that they would not let the packages, the luggage, be put on the airplane until they inspected it right in front of you. They would line up all the luggage, someone would come out, and they would one by one go through all the bags and question anything that looked remotely suspicious. They did this for every bag. So when they get to the part about going through Turkey to Lebanon, so Japan to Turkey to Lebanon, and hiding people inside a box for that trip, well, that's simply, I simply don't believe that, knowing Turkish security. So that makes me think that the Turks had to be in on it. The fact that he is Lebanese, he's a Lebanese citizen, and they claim that he had a French passport when he returned to Lebanon, so he entered the country legally, is interesting, because assuming he emerged from the box at some point for one of these flights, he would need the paperwork and identification. But for that last leg of the trip from Turkey to Lebanon, he wouldn't, because he was a Lebanese citizen. So as long as he could prove he was a Lebanese citizen, and Gaijin is famous, I don't think he'd have any problem. Certainly any family he has back in Lebanon would be able to produce it. It was interesting, the discussion around the French transport, because now that brings France into this. He was supposedly didn't have his passports. So it presumes that the Japanese were in possession of his French passport, which means somebody had to get him another French passport. And Gaijin's situation was pretty widely known. So now you have the French, you have the Turks, in addition to the Japanese and the Lebanese involved. This person who did this, Peter Taylor and his son Michael Taylor, well, Peter Taylor's checkered history is laid out in the article here. And they asked the question, well, how did Gaijin manage to connect with him? And he had to do so under the nose of the Japanese while out on bail. And surely the Japanese were keeping an eye on him, because even though they granted bail to him, it was a pricey bail. They obviously intended that he face the charges. They knew he was a very wealthy man, and they didn't want him to be able to flee the country. So he had to be under surveillance of some sort. And yet this American was able to meet up with him. The American, in question here had also worked for the FBI. And whenever you see a special forces background, FBI contacts, some legal history, some run-ins with the law, you have to think this was somebody who was an intelligence asset. Because with all that working against you, how do you travel freely these days? Much less take part in a high stakes caper like this. It, it's absolutely impossible. It's absolutely impossible. So it makes you think that the FBI and probably the CIA was involved in this operation. Now, the French, the Turks, the US are all allies of Japan. So why would they do such a thing? Is there any truth to what Gaijin is claiming about his mistreatment? Given that he was staying in a luxury hotel room and that the biggest hardship he had allegedly was that he couldn't see his wife, which also indicates that the Japanese had to have him under some surveillance, otherwise how would they prevent it? It doesn't really seem that way. Foreigners who are incarcerated in Japan are subject to probably better treatment than they would get if they were imprisoned within their own countries. The Japanese, culturally, do things by the book. They're very adamant about the need to follow the process and to be fair. Now, granted, that is fairness through their eyes. May not be the same thing everywhere, but they follow the procedure. And they view it as shameful to deviate from it. So the real shock of Gaijin pulling this off through Japanese eyes was no doubt that he didn't honor the terms of his bail. He was granted bail, which was something the Japanese did not have to do, but they did so. And then he betrayed it, and not only betrayed them, but badmouthed their judicial system and questioned the integrity of their judges in so doing. And that, no doubt, the Japanese took as a deep insult. When he says that nothing was ever arranged previously with the Japanese regarding the monies that he is alleged to have diverted, well, I don't really buy that either. You know, especially for so high a position, especially for something so closely tied to the Japanese image of themselves in the world as the chairmanship of Nissan. It's hard to believe that they would trust a foreigner so completely that they would deviate from their normal tendency to want to spell things out. You know, it's funny, for foreigners in Japan, you can look this up and on the internet. One of the things that they're confronted by is what sticklers the Japanese are for identification. They maintain to this day these little unique stamps. You know, your signature is not good enough. You have to have this stamp. You have to keep it on your body. And for any major financial transaction, that stamp is you. They don't want to hear about, well, I forgot my stamp. I lost it. They insist that you have it and you keep it with you basically for life. And yet these people who are such sticklers for that sort of detail and making sure that every I is dotted, every T crossed, would do a deal of this magnitude and just have it be a handshake deal. Well, I think Gaijin is flat out lying about that. The fact that he fled the country in the way that he did also tends to support his likely guilt on what they were charging him with. This took a lot of planning. This took a lot of money. Obviously, he forfeited his bail. He was willing to go through some considerable pain to avoid facing that judge on these charges. And that makes me think that there was something to it, and possibly even that they were going to find other things out which would make the sentence much worse. I mean, to engage the kind of people that he's talking about, obviously the two of them that are facing extradition now from the U.S., it's blown up into this big international problem. It's going to be interesting to see how the U.S. responds to that extradition request. Because if these guys were connected to the CIA, it's unlikely that we would want to burn them. But this is such a sticky issue now with Japan at a time when we need Japanese help in dealing with China. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out. In terms of values, we have a clear conflict between Japanese cultural values, Nissan's values, and Gosen's values. All bundled up with integrity. So you have to wonder, what was it? Where did that money go? If Gosen was diverting money, was it being put in his own pocket? All of it? Or was it being laundered for other things? If the latter, it might explain why Gosen is able to rely upon the goodwill of several other countries in getting him out of Japan before too much scrutiny was given to that. It's hard to see why people would go to those lengths for an embezzler. Because you have to think that certainly at the national level, you stand a lot more to lose from the animosity of the Japanese people than you would gain from whatever Gosen's able to come up with and write a check for. So this seems to be a much bigger issue, but it's interesting at how a familiarity with the cultures of Japan and Turkey in particular in this particular story helps you kind of get beneath the surface of it. There's much more lurking underneath the surface of this story. Now, as Nissan goes forward, I would imagine that the Japanese would be in no hurry to hire rock star CEOs who are not Japanese to run their companies as a result of this. I think it'll have a long-lasting impact. There'll be a lot of very respected Japanese figures who say, "I told you so." And the chance of Japanese culture within the business sphere opening up a bit more to international leadership has probably been lost. Given everything that's going on in China right now, there are repercussions from that as well. So I think, if anything, recent events are going to serve to turn Japan inward. Looked at from the Japanese perspective, this embarrassing national event was in effect a conspiracy against Japan by their allies. And I think that's going to have consequences. So keep an eye out for this. The Japanese do have a tendency from time to time for insularity. This speaks to that tendency. There will be a lot of people who start to try to push the pendulum back towards Japan being a little bit more closed off. We just had this pandemic. There's more evidence of what happens as a result of globalism. And so I think you're going to see a rise in nationalism in Japan, a desire on their part to enforce their culture in a more rigorous manner than they have for the past generation. And that's the real takeaway I would get from this story. Keep an eye on that, because as we all know, smuggling suspected criminals out of the country in a box made for a musical instrument is one thing, but culture is everything. Thank you. Have a good day.